When Man of Steel arrived in theaters in 2013, it carried an enormous responsibility. Superman is not just another superhero. He is arguably the most recognizable comic book character ever created, representing hope, justice, sacrifice, and the ideal of doing what is right despite overwhelming challenges. Bringing such an iconic character back to the big screen required a cast capable of honoring decades of history while presenting fresh interpretations for modern audiences. Director Zack Snyder assembled an impressive group of experienced actors alongside rising stars, creating one of the strongest ensemble casts ever seen in a superhero film. At the center of everything is Henry Cavill as Clark Kent, also known as Superman. Before earning the legendary cape, Cavill had already spent years building a respectable acting career. He appeared in television productions such as The Tudors, where he portrayed Charles Brandon and demonstrated both charisma and dramatic range. He also appeared in films like Stardust, Immortals, and The Count of Monte Cristo. Despite these performances, Cavill often found himself narrowly missing major breakthrough roles, including famous auditions for previous Superman projects and even James Bond. Those near misses eventually became part of his Hollywood story, making his casting as Superman feel like a reward for years of persistence. Cavill approached Superman with a clear understanding that the character needed emotional depth rather than simply appearing invincible. Instead of portraying a perfect hero from the beginning, he focused on Clark Kent's uncertainty, loneliness, and constant struggle to discover his place in humanity. His calm demeanor, imposing physical presence, and genuine sincerity gave audiences a Superman who felt powerful yet relatable. To prepare physically, Cavill underwent months of intense training, gaining significant muscle while maintaining athletic agility. His commitment to the role became immediately apparent and helped redefine Superman for a new generation. The success of Man of Steel transformed Henry Cavill into an international movie star almost overnight. He would continue portraying Superman in several DC films while also expanding his career with leading roles in Mission Impossible, Fallout, The Man from UNCLE, Enola Holmes, and later the hugely successful television adaptation of The Witcher. Although fans continue debating different interpretations of Superman, Cavill remains one of the most beloved actors ever to wear the iconic suit. Playing Superman's biological father, Jor-El, was Academy Award winner Russell Crowe. By the time Man of Steel entered production, Crowe had already established himself as one of Hollywood's most respected leading men. His unforgettable performance in Gladiator earned him the Academy Award for Best Actor and cemented his reputation as a performer capable of portraying both strength and vulnerability. Films like A Beautiful Mind, Cinderella Man, Master and Commander, and L.A. Confidential showcased his remarkable versatility. Crowe brought tremendous gravitas to Jor-El. Rather than appearing only briefly as Superman's father, his version became an active guide whose influence extended throughout the entire story. Crowe infused the character with wisdom, determination, and compassion, making Jor-El feel like the moral foundation upon which Superman's future would be built. His commanding voice and authoritative screen presence elevated every scene, particularly during Krypton's dramatic opening sequence. Kevin Costner portrayed Jonathan Kent, Clark's adoptive father on Earth. Costner had already enjoyed decades of success through classics such as Dances with Wolves, Field of Dreams, The Untouchables, JFK, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and The Bodyguard. Known for portraying honorable, grounded characters, Costner proved to be a natural choice for Jonathan Kent. Instead of depicting Jonathan as simply encouraging Clark to become a hero, the film explored the difficult decisions involved in raising a child with unimaginable powers. Costner delivered a restrained, emotional performance that emphasized fear, responsibility, and parental love. His scenes with Cavill became some of the film's most emotionally powerful moments because they highlighted Clark's internal conflict between protecting himself and helping others. Diane Lane portrayed Martha Kent, bringing warmth and emotional stability to the story. Lane had already earned widespread acclaim through films including Unfaithful, Under the Tuscan Sun, The Perfect Storm, and A Walk on the Moon. Her portrayal of Martha focused less on grand speeches and more on unconditional support. She became Clark's emotional anchor, constantly reminding him that his humanity was defined by his choices rather than his alien origin. Lane's gentle performance balanced the film's larger-than-life action with genuine family emotion. Amy Adams took on the role of Lois Lane after establishing herself as one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. By 2013, Adams had already received multiple Academy Award nominations thanks to performances in Junebug, Doubt, The Fighter, The Master, and The Muppets. Unlike previous portrayals, her Lois Lane was introduced as an accomplished investigative journalist from the very beginning. Adams emphasized Lois's intelligence, determination, and curiosity rather than making her simply a romantic interest. She actively uncovered Clark's identity through investigative reporting, allowing the character to contribute meaningfully to the narrative instead of merely reacting to events. Michael Shannon delivered one of the film's most memorable performances as General Zod. When Man of Steel premiered in the summer of 2013, it represented much more than a return of Superman to movie theaters. The character had not appeared in a solo film since Superman Returns in 2006, and audiences were eager to see how one of popular culture's oldest superheroes would be reinvented for a new generation. However, the world that welcomed Man of Steel was very different from the one Superman had originally inspired decades earlier. Modern audiences had embraced darker, more psychologically complex heroes, thanks in large part to the enormous success of Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. Rather than attempting to recreate the optimistic tone associated with earlier Superman films, Man of Steel embraced a more grounded and emotionally conflicted interpretation. That creative decision sparked conversations that continue more than a decade after the film's release. One of the film's most significant cultural contributions was its attempt to redefine Superman for the 21st century. Previous cinematic versions often portrayed Clark Kent as an almost perfect individual whose moral certainty rarely wavered. Henry Cavill's Superman, however, struggled with identity, isolation, fear, and responsibility before fully embracing his destiny. Instead of immediately becoming humanity's greatest protector, he spent much of the film searching for a purpose while trying to understand where he truly belonged. This more human interpretation resonated strongly with younger audiences who often viewed personal uncertainty as more relatable than flawless heroism. The film also reflected changing attitudes towards superheroes in cinema. During the early 2000s, comic book adaptations increasingly move away from colorful fantasy toward realism and emotional complexity. Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, Iron Man, and the Avengers had already demonstrated that audiences were willing to invest in heroes with psychological depth. Man of Steel extended that trend by presenting Superman not as an untouchable symbol, but as someone burdened by extraordinary expectations. His internal conflict became just as important as his physical strength, making the story feel closer to a science fiction drama than a traditional superhero adventure. Another important aspect of the film's cultural impact involved its treatment of immigration and identity. Superman has always been viewed as an immigrant story, with an alien child arriving on Earth and growing up while balancing two different worlds. Man of Steel placed that idea at the center of its narrative. Clark constantly questioned whether humanity would ever accept someone fundamentally different from themselves. His fear of rejection reflected conversations occurring throughout many societies regarding identity, belonging, diversity, and cultural integration. While the film never directly addressed contemporary politics, its themes encouraged audiences to interpret Superman's journey through modern social issues. The relationship between Krypton and Earth also generated philosophical discussions. Krypton represented a civilization that had sacrificed individuality for efficiency, with every citizen genetically designed for a predetermined purpose. In contrast, Earth represented freedom, unpredictability, and personal choice. Throughout the film, Clark rejected the idea that destiny should be assigned before birth, embracing humanity's ability to define its own future. These ideas sparked conversations about free will, genetics, technology, and whether society should prioritize order or personal freedom. Visually, Man of Steel influenced the presentation of superhero films throughout the following decade. Zack Snyder employed handheld camera work, natural lighting, large-scale destruction, and realistic combat physics that differed significantly from earlier comic book movies. Kryptonian battles resembled natural disasters more than stylized comic book fights. Characters crashed through buildings, generated sonic booms while flying, and demonstrated the terrifying consequences of nearly godlike power. Many later superhero films adopted similar approaches to depicting superhuman combat, emphasizing speed, weight, and environmental destruction. The film's action sequences became particularly influential because they finally portrayed Superman fighting at his full potential. Earlier films had often limited Superman's physical abilities due to technological constraints. Advances in digital effects allowed Man of Steel to depict battles at extraordinary speeds while maintaining visual clarity. The Smallville confrontation and the climactic battle over Metropolis established a new benchmark for portraying immensely powerful beings on screen. These sequences inspired countless discussions among filmmakers about how to realistically represent characters capable of moving faster than sound while delivering devastating physical force. Not every cultural conversation surrounding Man of Steel was entirely positive. One of the most debated aspects involved the extensive destruction of Metropolis during the final battle. Entire skyscrapers collapsed, city blocks were reduced to rubble, and enormous casualties were implied. Some viewers praised the realism of showing the true consequences of superhuman warfare, arguing that previous superhero films had often minimized collateral damage. Others criticized the scale of destruction, believing Superman should have prioritized protecting civilians more actively throughout the conflict. This debate became one of the defining discussions surrounding the film and influenced how later superhero movies approached large-scale action. Perhaps no moment generated more controversy than Superman's decision to kill General Zod. Traditionally, Superman is portrayed as a hero who refuses to take lives regardless of the circumstances. In Man of Steel, however, Clark kills Zod to prevent innocent civilians from being murdered. The scene immediately divided audiences. Some believed it demonstrated Superman making the ultimate sacrifice by compromising his own ideals to save others. Others argued that the decision fundamentally misunderstood the character's moral foundation. Regardless of individual opinion, the moment became one of the most discussed scenes in modern superhero cinema and remains a frequent topic whenever Superman adaptations are compared. Creating Man of Steel was one of the most ambitious productions ever undertaken for a superhero film. Warner Brothers was not simply making another comic book adaptation. The studio was attempting to relaunch one of the most recognizable fictional characters in history, while laying the foundation for an entirely new cinematic universe. After Superman Returns failed to generate the level of excitement the studio had hoped for, executives believed the character needed a complete reinvention. Rather than continuing the previous series, they decided to start from scratch, giving filmmakers the freedom to rethink Superman's origin for modern audiences. One of the most important creative decisions happened before cameras even began rolling. Christopher Nolan, whose Dark Knight trilogy had completely transformed Batman's cinematic reputation, was invited to help shape the project as producer. Although Nolan did not direct the film, his influence was significant from the beginning. He believed Superman should be approached with the same seriousness that had made Batman Begins successful. Instead of presenting the story as colorful fantasy, Nolan encouraged a grounded emotional approach that explored how an alien with incredible abilities would realistically exist in the modern world. To bring that vision to life, Zack Snyder was selected as director. Snyder had already established a distinctive visual style through films such as Dawn of the Dead, 300, Watchmen, and Legend of the Guardians. Known for dynamic action sequences, striking imagery, and careful attention to visual composition, Snyder seemed like an unusual but exciting choice for Superman. Rather than imitating the optimistic tone of earlier adaptations, he wanted audiences to experience Superman almost as though humanity were encountering an actual extraterrestrial for the first time. Screenwriter David S. Goyer developed the story alongside Christopher Nolan before writing the screenplay. Goyer was already familiar with comic book adaptations, having worked on Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and Blade. His script intentionally avoided repeating the familiar structure audiences had already seen several times. Instead of beginning with Clark Kent as an adult reporter in Metropolis, the screenplay used a non-linear narrative that gradually revealed Clark's childhood through flashbacks. This storytelling technique allowed viewers to discover Superman's past while simultaneously following his present-day journey toward becoming Earth's protector. Casting Superman proved to be one of the production's biggest challenges. The filmmakers searched extensively before selecting Henry Cavill. Ironically, Cavill had previously auditioned for Superman years earlier, but was considered too young for the role at the time. He had also come close to being cast in several other major franchises before narrowly missing out. When Zack Snyder met him wearing casual clothing, The director reportedly realized immediately that Cavill possessed the physical appearance and quiet confidence necessary to portray Superman. The decision ultimately rewarded an actor who had spent years patiently waiting for his breakthrough opportunity. Preparing Cavill for the role required extraordinary physical dedication. Under the guidance of professional trainers, he followed an intense workout program involving heavy weightlifting, functional athletic training, and strict nutritional planning. He consumed thousands of calories each day while carefully balancing muscle growth with agility. Training sessions often lasted several hours and focused not only on building impressive size, but also on creating movements appropriate for someone capable of incredible feats of strength. Cavill later explained that maintaining the demanding diet became just as difficult as the workouts themselves. Michael Shannon approached General Zod very differently from traditional comic book villains. Rather than viewing Zod as evil, Shannon believed the character genuinely considered himself Krypton's last hope. During rehearsals, he focused on portraying unwavering conviction rather than simple anger or cruelty. His interpretation emphasized that Zod was genetically engineered to protect Krypton above all else, making every action he took feel logical from his own perspective. This approach added emotional complexity to the conflict between Superman and Zod. Russell Crowe also contributed creatively to his portrayal of Jor-El. He worked closely with Zack Snyder to develop Jor-El's calm authority and wisdom while ensuring the character remained emotionally connected to his family. Crowe suggested subtle adjustments to dialogue and delivery that emphasized Jor-El's compassion rather than portraying him merely as a scientific genius. His scenes established the emotional foundation for Superman's entire journey. One of the production's greatest achievements involved creating the world of Krypton. Rather than depicting Krypton as a perfectly clean, futuristic civilization, the filmmakers wanted it to feel ancient, sophisticated, and biologically integrated with advanced technology. Production designers combined influences from mythology, medieval armor, organic architecture, and science fiction to create a civilization unlike anything previously seen in Superman films. The Kryptonian costumes reflected this philosophy. Instead of smooth plastic suits, nearly every costume featured intricate textures, inspired by chainmail, muscle fibers, and alien biological patterns. Designers incorporated thousands of microscopic details into the digital models, so the costumes would appear alive under different lighting conditions. Even Superman's iconic suit abandoned the traditional red trunks worn in comic books for decades. The updated design emphasized Kryptonian heritage while presenting a more realistic military-inspired appearance. Many of Krypton's environments were constructed using enormous practical sets combined with digital extensions. The council chamber, Jor-El's laboratory, and several military interiors were physically built so actors could interact naturally with their surroundings. These sets were then expanded using computer-generated architecture that stretched far beyond what existed on the soundstage. Filming took place across numerous locations around the world. Unlike many traditional superhero origin stories, Man of Steel chooses a narrative structure that immediately separates itself from earlier Superman adaptations. Rather than beginning with Clark Kent already living in Metropolis and gradually revealing his past through simple exposition, the film tells its story through a combination of present-day events and carefully placed flashbacks. This non-linear approach allows the audience to discover Clark's life at the same pace that he accepts his own destiny. Every memory, every lesson, and every emotional experience contributes to building the Superman who ultimately emerges by the film's conclusion. The story begins not on Earth, but on the distant planet Krypton. Instead of portraying Krypton as a peaceful paradise moments before its destruction, the film introduces it as an advanced civilization already suffering from political corruption, environmental collapse, and rigid social control. Every citizen is genetically engineered for a predetermined purpose, eliminating free will in favor of absolute efficiency. This immediately establishes one of the film's central philosophical ideas, the conflict between destiny and personal choice. Jor-El, one of Krypton's greatest scientists, realizes that the planet has reached a point of no return. Years of exploiting the planet's natural core have made destruction inevitable, yet Krypton's political leaders refuse to accept his warnings. At the same time, General Zod launches a military coup in an attempt to seize control of the government. Unlike many cinematic villains who simply seek power for themselves, Zod genuinely believes he is saving Krypton through force. His revolution fails, and he and his followers are sentenced to imprisonment in the Phantom Zone. Knowing that Krypton cannot be saved, Jor-El and his wife Lara make the impossible decision to send their newborn son Kal-El to Earth aboard a small spacecraft. Before launching the vessel, Jor-El secretly encodes the entire genetic history of Krypton's future population into his son's cells. In doing so, Kal-El becomes not only the last natural-born Kryptonian in centuries, but also the key to potentially rebuilding his civilization. Moments after the spacecraft escapes, Krypton explodes, wiping out nearly its entire population. From this dramatic opening, the film shifts to Earth, where Clark Kent is introduced not as Superman, but as a wandering adult searching for purpose. Rather than presenting his childhood in chronological order, the narrative gradually reveals key moments through flashbacks whenever events in the present trigger memories from his past. This structure transforms Clark's life into a puzzle that slowly assembles itself before the audience. Clark travels from place to place, working anonymous jobs while secretly using his extraordinary abilities to save strangers whenever danger appears. Whether rescuing workers on an oil rig, helping children, or preventing accidents, he avoids public recognition because he fears how humanity might react if they discovered someone with impossible powers. These early sequences establish that Clark has always wanted to help others, yet years of caution have taught him to remain hidden. The first flashbacks introduce young Clark struggling to control his heightened senses at school. Overwhelmed by sounds, sights, and sensations beyond normal human perception, he experiences panic and isolation. His mother, Martha Kent, teaches him to focus on familiar voices and emotions, helping him regain control. These scenes emphasize that Clark's powers were not gifts without consequences. Growing up different often left him frightened and confused rather than empowered. Another important memory shows Clark being bullied by classmates. Although he possesses the strength to defend himself effortlessly, Jonathan Kent insists that he exercise restraint. These moments define Clark's moral education. His parents teach him that true strength is measured not by physical power, but by wisdom, patience, and compassion. This lesson becomes increasingly significant as the story progresses. In the present timeline, investigative journalist Lois Lane begins investigating mysterious reports surrounding an ancient Kryptonian scout ship discovered beneath Arctic ice. Clark, working nearby under another assumed identity, secretly enters the alien vessel after sensing a strange connection to it. Inside, he activates technology that has remained dormant for thousands of years. Within the ship, Clark encounters an advanced artificial intelligence based on Jor-El's consciousness. Through this interaction, he finally learns the truth about his origins. Jor-El explains Krypton's history, the reason Clark was sent to Earth, and the extraordinary responsibilities that now rest upon him. Clark also receives a Kryptonian suit that will eventually become Superman's iconic costume. This sequence marks the story's first major turning point, because Clark finally understands both his past and his potential future. Meanwhile, Lois witnesses Clark saving her life after the scout ship's automated defense system attacks them. Instead of exposing his identity, despite pressure from government officials and media organizations, she chooses to protect his secret. This decision establishes mutual trust between the two characters long before their romantic relationship fully develops. The narrative continues through additional flashbacks, revealing perhaps the most emotionally devastating moment of Clark's childhood. Jonathan Kent sacrifices his own life during a powerful tornado rather than allowing Clark to reveal his extraordinary abilities by rescuing him publicly. Jonathan believes the world is not yet ready to accept someone like his son. Clark obeys his father's silent command despite knowing he could easily intervene. This heartbreaking moment shapes Clark's understanding of sacrifice and responsibility for years afterward. One of the reasons Man of Steel continues to generate discussion years after its release is that it operates on multiple levels beyond its spectacular action sequences. While it is undeniably a superhero film filled with alien invasions, breathtaking visual effects, and epic battles, beneath the surface lies a story that explores identity, destiny, sacrifice, hope, family, freedom, and humanity's place in the universe. Director Zack Snyder and screenwriter David S. Goyer intentionally built the film around philosophical questions rather than simply focusing on good versus evil. Every major character represents a different worldview, and nearly every important scene reinforces the movie's deeper themes through visual symbolism and emotional storytelling. Perhaps the film's most significant theme is the search for identity. Throughout most of the story, Clark Kent exists between two worlds without fully belonging to either one. He is biologically Kryptonian, possessing extraordinary abilities far beyond those of ordinary humans, yet he was raised entirely on Earth by Jonathan and Martha Kentucky. This creates an internal conflict that defines nearly every decision he makes. Clark constantly wonders whether he should embrace his alien heritage or continue hiding among humanity. Unlike many traditional superhero stories where the hero quickly accepts their destiny, Man of Steel portrays identity as something discovered gradually through experience, failure, and personal choice. This struggle is reflected visually throughout the film. Clark is repeatedly shown standing alone in vast open landscapes, isolated mountains, frozen wilderness, and empty highways. These environments symbolize his emotional loneliness. Even when surrounded by people, he never fully feels that he belongs. The enormous spaces surrounding him emphasize how disconnected he feels from both his Kryptonian origins and his human upbringing. Only after accepting both identities does he finally stop wandering and establish a permanent place within society. Closely connected to identity is the theme of choice versus destiny. Kryptonian society is built upon predetermined purpose. Every individual is genetically engineered before birth to fulfill one specific role within civilization. Scientists remain scientists. Soldiers remain soldiers. Leaders remain leaders. No one chooses their own future because every life has already been planned. General Zod embodies this philosophy completely. His entire existence revolves around fulfilling the mission he was created to perform, protecting Krypton regardless of the cost. Clark, however, represents the opposite idea. As Krypton's first natural birth in generations, he is free from genetic programming. He possesses the ability to define himself through his own decisions rather than biological destiny. This distinction becomes one of the film's central philosophical arguments. Jor-El believes that true greatness comes from freedom, uncertainty, and personal growth rather than predetermined perfection. Earth becomes important not simply because it offers survival, but because it allows Kal-El to become whoever he chooses. Every heroic act Clark performs is meaningful precisely because he chooses compassion rather than being programmed to display it. General Zod serves as more than a physical enemy. Symbolically, he represents absolute determinism. Everything about his personality reflects rigid purpose. He cannot imagine abandoning Krypton's traditions because his identity literally depends upon fulfilling his assigned function. Even after Krypton is destroyed, he continues pursuing the same objective because he has no capacity to redefine himself. Superman defeats Zod not merely through strength, but by embracing the freedom to evolve beyond his origins. Another major theme explored throughout the film is the sacrifice. Nearly every important character willingly gives something valuable for the sake of others. Jor-El sacrifices his own life to ensure his son's survival. Lara sends her only child across the galaxy, knowing she will never see him again. Jonathan Kent accepts death during the tornado because he believes protecting Clark's secret will ultimately save countless lives. Clark repeatedly risks exposure while helping strangers despite knowing discovery could permanently change his life. These sacrifices are not portrayed as glorious victories, but as emotionally painful choices. Characters often lose what they value most while acting according to their principles. Jonathan's death is particularly significant because Clark possesses the power to save him effortlessly. The emotional tragedy comes not from physical inability, but from accepting restraint. Jonathan believes revealing Clark's powers too early could endanger humanity's future relationship with him, whether viewers agree with his decision or not. The scene reinforces the idea that genuine heroism often requires personal loss rather than easy success. The film also presents hope as something earned rather than automatically given. Traditionally, Superman represents optimism from the very beginning. In Man of Steel, hope emerges gradually through difficult experiences. Clark spends years hiding, doubting himself, and questioning whether the world will ever accept him. Humanity initially responds to his existence with suspicion and fear rather than admiration. Superman must first prove through actions that he deserves trust. Hope, therefore, becomes a result of perseverance instead of an assumed characteristic. This idea is reinforced by the famous Kryptonian symbol displayed on Superman's chest. Rather than functioning merely as a family crest, Jor-El explains that it represents hope within Kryptonian culture. The symbol, therefore, carries multiple meanings simultaneously. It honors Clark's biological family, while also expressing the possibility of a better future for both Krypton and Earth. Whenever the emblem appears prominently on screen, it reminds viewers that Superman's greatest strength lies not in his physical abilities, but in the ideals he represents. Family forms another emotional foundation of the story. One of the defining characteristics of Man of Steel is its striking visual identity. From the very first frame on Krypton to the final moments in Metropolis, the film establishes a cinematic style that deliberately separates itself from every previous Superman adaptation. Rather than embracing the bright colors, clean compositions, and optimistic atmosphere traditionally associated with the character, director Zack Snyder and cinematographer Amir Mokri crafted a world that feels grounded, realistic, and almost documentary-like despite its extraordinary science fiction elements. Every visual decision, from camera movement and lighting to color grading and composition, supports the film's central goal of presenting Superman as if he truly existed in the modern world. The film immediately establishes this approach during its opening scenes on Krypton. Instead of depicting the alien world as a polished, futuristic utopia filled with smooth metallic structures and pristine technology, Krypton appears ancient, weathered, and organic. Massive mountains surround monumental cities built from complex geometric designs that resemble both advanced machinery and living organisms. The architecture combines futuristic engineering with historical influences, creating a civilization that feels thousands of years old rather than recently developed. The color palette used on Krypton reinforces this atmosphere. Shades of bronze, silver, dark gray, black, and muted gold dominate nearly every environment. Warm colors are used sparingly, giving the planet a sense of dignity, but also suggesting a civilization approaching its inevitable collapse. Unlike many science fiction films that rely on bright neon colors to represent advanced technology, Man of Steel presents Krypton's technology as elegant, restrained, and deeply integrated into its natural surroundings. Lighting plays an equally important role throughout these opening sequences. Much of Krypton is illuminated by natural sunlight filtered through clouds and atmospheric haze. Even indoor environments avoid excessive artificial lighting, instead relying on soft illumination that emphasizes texture and depth. This approach immediately grounds a fantastical setting in a believable physical reality. Once the story shifts to Earth, the cinematography changes while maintaining visual consistency. Smallville and the surrounding countryside are photographed using natural landscapes, practical locations, and available light whenever possible. Vast wheat fields, open highways, distant mountains, and quiet farms create an enormous sense of scale around Clark Kent. These environments communicate both freedom and isolation. Clark lives in wide open spaces, yet he constantly feels emotionally alone. One of the film's most distinctive cinematic techniques is its extensive use of handheld camera work. Unlike many superhero movies that rely on perfectly stable shots and highly choreographed camera movements, Man of Steel frequently employs handheld cinematography during conversations, emotional scenes, and even certain action sequences. This subtle camera movement gives the impression that viewers are witnessing real events unfolding rather than carefully staged comic book fantasy. The handheld style also increases emotional intimacy. During scenes between Clark and his adoptive parents, the camera often remains close to the actors, gently shifting as though responding naturally to their movements. This creates a feeling of authenticity rarely seen in superhero films. Rather than emphasizing spectacle, these moments prioritize character relationships and emotional vulnerability. Flashback sequences receive their own visual treatment as well. Clark's childhood memories often feature softer lighting, warmer colors, and slightly more intimate framing. Although these scenes are not heavily stylized, they possess a subtle nostalgia quality that distinguishes them from the present-day storyline. The visual differences help audiences immediately recognize transitions between past and present without relying on dramatic editing techniques. Framing is another essential component of the film's storytelling. Zack Snyder frequently positions Clark alone within large compositions, surrounded by enormous natural environments or towering architectural structures. These images reinforce the character's emotional isolation while reminding viewers of his unique place within the world. Whether standing atop icy mountains, walking across endless fields, or observing humanity from a distance, Clark is consistently framed as someone caught between two identities. Symmetry also appears throughout many important scenes. Kryptonian architecture features carefully balanced geometric designs, reflecting the rigid order of their society. In contrast, Earth's environments are intentionally less symmetrical, filled with irregular landscapes, unpredictable weather, and organic imperfections. This visual contrast subtly reinforces one of the film's major themes. Krypton represents predetermined order, while Earth symbolizes freedom and individuality. Perhaps the film's most celebrated visual achievement is its portrayal of Superman's flight. Previous Superman films often depicted flying with graceful elegance, emphasizing smooth movement and effortless control. Man of Steel approaches flight from an entirely different perspective. Superman accelerates with explosive force, generating shockwaves, sonic booms, and violent bursts of energy. The camera frequently struggles to keep pace with his incredible speed, creating the sensation that viewers are witnessing an object moving beyond normal human comprehension. The first flight sequence perfectly illustrates this philosophy. Rather than soaring confidently from the beginning, Clark repeatedly crashes into mountainsides, loses control, and gradually learns to master his abilities. The camera follows him from multiple perspectives, sometimes soaring alongside him, sometimes trailing behind, and sometimes observing from enormous distances. The sound of Man of Steel is every bit as important as its visuals. While audiences often remember the breathtaking action scenes, the powerful imagery, and Henry Cavill's commanding performance, much of the film's emotional impact comes from what is heard rather than what is seen. Director Zack Snyder understood that Superman's return to the big screen required not only a fresh visual identity, but also an entirely new musical language. Instead of relying on the legendary orchestral theme that had become inseparable from previous Superman films, the production chose to build a completely original sonic experience. The result was one of the boldest musical reinventions in modern blockbuster cinema, combining Hans Zimmer's emotionally driven score with immersive sound design that made every flight, every explosion, and every quiet conversation feel larger than life. Perhaps the most significant creative decision during post-production was hiring composer Hans Zimmer. By the time Man of Steel entered production, Zimmer had already established himself as one of the most influential film composers in Hollywood. His work on Gladiator, The Lion King, Inception, Pirates of the Caribbean, The Dark Knight Trilogy, Sherlock Holmes, and numerous other productions had demonstrated his ability to create unforgettable musical identities. However, accepting Superman presented a unique challenge. John Williams' iconic theme from the 1978 Superman film remained one of the most recognizable pieces of film music ever written. Zimmer initially hesitated to take the project because he deeply respected Williams' work and did not want to compete with such an enduring masterpiece. After considerable thought, Zimmer decided that the only way forward was to avoid imitation entirely. Rather than referencing Williams' famous melody or attempting to modernize it, he composed a completely new musical identity that reflected Zack Snyder's reinterpretation of Superman. This decision proved essential because Man of Steel itself was not attempting to recreate earlier films. It was introducing a different version of the character, one defined by uncertainty, personal discovery, and emotional complexity rather than immediate confidence and optimism. Zimmer's approach focused less on traditional heroic fanfare and more on gradual emotional development. Instead of presenting Superman with a fully formed musical theme from the beginning, the score evolves alongside Clark Kent's journey. Early compositions often feature strained piano notes, gentle strings, and subtle electronic textures that emphasize loneliness and self-discovery. As Clark gradually accepts his identity, the music grows larger, adding percussion, brass, and increasingly powerful orchestral layers until it finally reaches its full heroic potential during the film's climactic moments. The centerpiece of the soundtrack is a composition often associated with Superman's first successful flight. Rather than relying on triumphant brass immediately, the piece begins quietly with repeating rhythmic patterns that slowly build momentum. Layer by layer, additional instruments enter until the music explodes into a soaring orchestral crescendo that perfectly mirrors Clark's emotional liberation. The sequence becomes unforgettable because the score does not simply accompany the visuals. It actively tells the story of a man discovering who he truly is. Every increase in volume, every added instrument, and every rhythmic acceleration reflects Clark's growing confidence as he embraces the abilities he spent his entire life trying to hide. Zimmer frequently employed repeating musical motifs throughout the score instead of long, easily recognizable melodies. These repeated patterns create emotional momentum while allowing individual themes to evolve naturally across different scenes. This technique mirrors the film's central narrative structure, where Clark's identity develops gradually rather than appearing fully formed from the beginning. Even audiences unfamiliar with musical composition often sense this progression subconsciously because the score continuously grows alongside the character. Percussion plays an especially important role throughout the soundtrack. Massive drums, deep rhythmic pulses, and powerful impacts create an almost primal sense of energy during action scenes. Rather than simply increasing volume to create excitement, Zimmer carefully layers different percussion instruments to produce forward momentum. This gives battles a relentless driving force while avoiding the repetitive bombast common in many blockbuster scores. Brass instruments also receive distinctive treatment. Instead of performing traditional military-style heroic fanfares, horns and trumpets often produce sustained emotional chords that emphasize determination rather than celebration. Superman is not presented as an invincible champion who enjoys victory. He is portrayed as someone carrying enormous responsibility, and the brass arrangements reflect that emotional weight. Strings contribute significantly to the film's quieter moments. During scenes involving Jonathan and Martha Kent, delicate violin and cello passages create warmth without becoming sentimental. The music respects the emotional restraint shown by the performances. Rather than instructing audiences how to feel, it gently reinforces the sincerity of the family relationships. These intimate compositions provide essential contrast to the thunderous orchestral power heard during Kryptonian battles. The opening scenes on Krypton feature some of the score's most unusual instrumentation. Zimmer combines orchestral music with electronic textures, processed percussion, and experimental sound design to create an atmosphere that feels both ancient and futuristic. The music avoids obvious science fiction cliches by emphasizing emotional grandeur instead of technological spectacle. As a result, Krypton feels like a living civilization with centuries of history, rather than simply another alien planet. General Zod's musical identity differs noticeably from Superman's. While Clark's themes gradually expand toward hope and emotional openness, Zod's music remains rigid, relentless, and uncompromising. Heavy percussion, aggressive brass, and darker harmonies emphasize the character's unwavering commitment to his mission. When Man of Steel was released in June 2013, it immediately became one of the most talked about films of the year. Few superhero movies have generated such passionate discussion among critics, longtime Superman fans, casual moviegoers, and comic book readers. Expectations had been extraordinarily high. Superman had not starred in a solo theatrical film for 7 years, and Warner Brothers was counting on this reboot to relaunch one of its most valuable franchises. The involvement of Christopher Nolan, the success of Zack Snyder's previous films, and the casting of Henry Cavill all contributed to enormous anticipation before release. Once audiences finally saw the film, however, reactions proved to be both enthusiastic and deeply divided. From a commercial standpoint, Man of Steel was unquestionably a success. The film opened strongly around the world, earning an impressive debut weekend and maintaining solid box office performance throughout its theatrical run. It ultimately grossed hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide, becoming one of the highest-grossing Superman films ever produced at the time. The financial performance reassured Warner Brothers that audiences remained interested in Superman and convinced the studio to move forward with plans for a larger interconnected DC cinematic universe. Many audience members praised the film for successfully modernizing Superman. After years of comparisons with earlier versions of the character, viewers appreciated seeing a Superman who felt more grounded, emotionally vulnerable, and relatable. Henry Cavill's performance received widespread recognition, with many praising his ability to balance quiet humility with immense physical presence. His portrayal of Clark Kent resonated particularly well with younger audiences who connected with his struggles to find identity and purpose before embracing his destiny. Michael Shannon also received considerable praise for his performance as General Zod. Rather than portraying a one-dimensional villain motivated by simple greed or revenge, Shannon presented Zod as a tragic military leader completely devoted to preserving Krypton. His unwavering commitment to his mission made him feel dangerous not because he enjoyed destruction, but because he believed his actions were morally justified. Many critics considered Zod one of the strongest antagonists in superhero cinema, precisely because his motivations remained understandable even when his methods became horrifying. Hans Zimmer's musical score was almost universally celebrated. Even viewers who expressed reservations about other aspects of the film frequently praised the soundtrack as one of its greatest achievements. Zimmer's decision to create an entirely original musical identity, instead of referencing John Williams' legendary Superman theme, was initially controversial, but many eventually came to appreciate the emotional depth and modern energy of the new compositions. The music accompanying Superman's first flight quickly became one of the most memorable moments in the entire film, and remains highly regarded among film music enthusiasts. The visual effects and action sequences also attracted significant admiration. Many reviewers acknowledge that Man of Steel finally presented Superman's incredible powers in a way that previous technology had made impossible. The high-speed aerial combat, devastating Kryptonian battles, and breathtaking flight sequences impressed audiences who had never before seen Superman portrayed with such overwhelming physical realism. The Smallville battle and the climactic confrontation in Metropolis were frequently highlighted as technical achievements that raised the standard for superhero action. The performances of Kevin Costner and Diane Lane also earned praise for bringing emotional sincerity to Jonathan and Martha Kentucky. Their portrayal of Clark's adoptive parents emphasized compassion, restraint, and unconditional love, grounding the extraordinary science fiction story in relatable family relationships. Amy Adams' interpretation of Lois Lane received positive attention as well, particularly because the character was presented as an intelligent investigative journalist whose actions actively influence the story rather than simply serving as Superman's romantic interest. However, despite these strengths, Man of Steel also became one of the most debated superhero films of its generation. While many admired its ambitious approach, others believe the film misunderstood key elements of Superman's traditional character. One of the most common criticisms involved the movie's overall tone. Some viewers appreciated the serious, realistic atmosphere inspired by Christopher Nolan's influence, while others argued that Superman should represent optimism, warmth, and inspiration rather than emotional heaviness. Critics in this camp felt the film focused too heavily on internal conflict and existential uncertainty, leaving too little room for the hopeful personality traditionally associated with Superman. The extensive destruction during the final act became perhaps the most controversial aspect of the entire production. As Superman and General Zod battled across Metropolis, countless skyscrapers collapsed, entire neighborhoods were devastated, and enormous civilian casualties were implied. Some viewers praised the sequence for realistically portraying the consequences of two nearly invincible beings fighting inside a populated city. They argued that previous superhero films often ignored the devastating impact such conflicts would realistically produce. Others strongly disagreed. Critics questioned why Superman appeared to spend relatively little time actively moving the battle away from civilians or preventing widespread destruction. They believed the enormous collateral damage conflicted with Superman's traditional role as a protector whose first priority should always be saving innocent lives. This criticism became so widespread that it directly influenced later DC films, which placed much greater emphasis on civilian rescue efforts during large-scale action sequences. Even more divisive was Superman's decision to kill General Zod during the film's climax. In comic books and many previous adaptations, Superman is famous for refusing to kill even his greatest enemies. When Man of Steel was released in 2013, few people could have predicted just how influential it would become within the superhero genre. Although its reception divided critics and audiences, its long-term legacy extends far beyond its box office performance. The film fundamentally changed the direction of DC's cinematic future, introduced one of the most discussed portrayals of Superman ever created, influenced the visual language of modern superhero films, and helped redefine how audiences viewed comic book adaptations. More than a decade after its release, Man of Steel continues to inspire filmmakers, shape fan discussions, influence comic book storytelling, and serve as one of the defining superhero films of the 21st century. Perhaps the film's most immediate legacy was its role as a foundation of DC's interconnected cinematic universe. Warner Brothers viewed Man of Steel not simply as a standalone Superman story, but as the beginning of a much larger franchise. Its success encouraged the studio to move forward with ambitious plans that would eventually include Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, Wonder Woman, Suicide Squad, Justice League, Aquaman, Shazam, The Flash, and several other interconnected productions. While the overall direction of the franchise would evolve over the following years, Man of Steel remained the starting point from which every subsequent DC cinematic story emerged. Henry Cavill's portrayal of Superman quickly became one of the film's most enduring contributions. Before 2013, many audiences still associated the character primarily with Christopher Reeve's legendary performance. Cavill did not attempt to imitate that portrayal. Instead, he presented a quieter, more introspective Superman whose emotional journey emphasized uncertainty before confidence. Over time, this interpretation gained an extraordinarily loyal fan following. Many viewers appreciated the humanity Cavill brought to Clark Kent, seeing him as a believable individual burdened by enormous responsibility rather than an unreachable symbol of perfection. As the years passed, support for Cavill's Superman only continued to grow. Fans repeatedly expressed their desire to see him return in future films, launching numerous online campaigns advocating for additional appearances. Social media movements calling for continuation of his storyline became some of the most visible fan campaigns in modern superhero cinema. Regardless of changing studio plans, Cavill's version of Superman remains deeply admired by millions of viewers around the world. Zack Snyder's visual approach also left a lasting impact on the superhero genre. Before Man of Steel, many comic book films emphasized colorful aesthetics, highly stylized action, and relatively straightforward heroic storytelling. Snyder demonstrated that superhero movies could embrace large-scale philosophical themes while maintaining blockbuster spectacle. His combination of grounded cinematography, realistic lighting, handheld camera movement, and immense visual scale influenced numerous productions that followed. The film's depiction of superhuman combat proved particularly influential. Previous Superman adaptations often portrayed fights as relatively restrained due to technological limitations or creative choices. Man of Steel finally visualized what battles between nearly invincible beings might realistically resemble. Characters accelerated faster than sound, generated shockwaves with every movement, and transformed entire city blocks through the sheer force of their collisions. Many later superhero films adopted similar approaches when depicting characters with extraordinary physical abilities, emphasizing speed, momentum, and environmental consequences. The movie also helped establish a more serious approach to comic book storytelling within DC Productions. While Marvel Studios had achieved tremendous success by balancing action with humor and light-hearted character interactions, Man of Steel pursued a different identity. It embraced dramatic themes involving identity, sacrifice, destiny, and personal responsibility. Whether audiences preferred this tone or not, it demonstrated that superhero films could successfully explore philosophical questions while still delivering large-scale entertainment. Hans Zimmer's musical score became another lasting element of the film's legacy. Although John Williams' Superman theme remains one of cinema's most recognizable musical compositions, Zimmer succeeded in creating an entirely separate identity that audiences immediately associated with Henry Cavill's Superman. The soaring music accompanying Clark's first flight became especially iconic, appearing in countless tribute videos, fan edits, documentaries, sporting events, and online celebrations of inspirational moments. Even viewers unfamiliar with the film often recognized Zimmer's emotional composition almost instantly. The first flight sequence itself has become one of the defining moments in modern superhero filmmaking. Frequently ranked among the greatest superhero scenes ever created, it perfectly combines visual effects, cinematography, editing, performance, and music into a sequence that captures the emotional exhilaration of discovering one's true potential. One of the most fascinating aspects of Man of Steel is how differently it has been interpreted by audiences over the years. Unlike many blockbuster superhero films that receive a fairly consistent public reaction, Man of Steel has inspired an unusually wide range of opinions, emotional responses, and philosophical discussions. Some viewers immediately embrace Zack Snyder's darker and more realistic interpretation of Superman, while others struggle with how dramatically it departed from previous versions of the character. Yet, regardless of whether audiences loved or criticized the film, very few people left the theater without something to think about. More than a decade later, the conversations surrounding Man of Steel continue, proving that the movie connected with viewers on a level that extends far beyond simple entertainment. For many younger audiences, Man of Steel became their introduction to Superman. Unlike previous generations, who often grew up watching Christopher Reeve's bright and optimistic portrayal, viewers born during the late 1990s and early 2000s encountered Henry Cavill as their first cinematic Superman. As a result, many of them never viewed the film as a reinterpretation of an older hero. Instead, this version became their definition of Superman. To these audiences, Clark Kent was not immediately confident or perfectly certain about his mission. He was someone who struggled with isolation, questioned his purpose, and gradually learned what kind of person he wanted to become. This generational difference significantly influenced how the film was received. Older fans who had stronger emotional attachments to earlier portrayals sometimes expected Superman to embody unwavering optimism from the beginning. Younger audiences, however, often appreciated seeing a hero who reflected many of the uncertainties they experienced in their own lives. Clark's search for identity, his fear of being rejected, and his desire to find his place in the world felt deeply relatable. In an era where many people openly discuss mental health, loneliness, and questions of belonging, this more vulnerable Superman resonated with viewers who saw pieces of themselves in his journey. Many audience members interpreted the film primarily as a coming-of-age story rather than a traditional superhero adventure. Although Clark possesses extraordinary abilities from childhood, emotional maturity arrives much more slowly. Throughout the film, he learns patience, restraint, compassion, responsibility, and self-acceptance. His greatest challenge is not defeating General Zod, but deciding what kind of man he wants to become. For viewers who focus on character development rather than action, the film became an exploration of personal growth disguised as a science fiction blockbuster. One of the themes that resonated most strongly with audiences was the feeling of being different. Clark spends his entire childhood hiding abilities that separate him from everyone around him. He fears rejection, misunderstanding, and isolation. Many viewers who had experienced bullying, social anxiety, discrimination, or feelings of not fitting and identified with this emotional struggle. Although most people obviously cannot fly or possess superhuman strength, the experience of feeling different from those around you is nearly universal. Clark's journey toward accepting himself became one of the film's most emotionally meaningful elements for many fans. Immigrant communities and multicultural audiences also found powerful symbolism within Clark's story. Superman has always represented an immigrant narrative, arriving from another world and building a life within an unfamiliar society. Man of Steel emphasized this aspect more directly than many previous adaptations. Clark constantly balanced loyalty to his Kryptonian heritage with love for his adopted home on Earth. Many viewers interpreted this as reflecting the experiences of people who grow up between multiple cultures, attempting to honor their origins while embracing new identities. The film suggested that embracing both backgrounds could become a source of strength rather than conflict. Parents often responded emotionally to the film's exploration of family relationships. Jonathan and Martha Kent's unconditional love for Clark resonated deeply with audiences raising children of their own. Their concern was never whether Clark possessed extraordinary powers, but whether he would become a compassionate, responsible individual. Jonathan's difficult decisions, particularly during the tornado sequence, generated intense emotional reactions because they reflected the painful reality that parents sometimes make sacrifices their children cannot fully understand until much later in life. The relationship between Jor-El and Lara also touched many viewers. Although their screen time is relatively brief, their willingness to send their infant son across a galaxy in hopes of giving him a better future mirrored the sacrifices countless real families have made throughout history. Parents who leave familiar homes to provide greater opportunities for their children often saw echoes of their own experiences within Krypton's tragic farewell. Another reason the film remained emotionally significant for many audiences was its emphasis on hope earned through adversity. Superman does not become humanity's symbol of hope because life has been easy. He reaches that point only after years of confusion, loneliness, painful loss, and impossible decisions. Viewers facing personal struggles often interpreted Clark's journey as a reminder that purpose and confidence frequently emerge only after periods of uncertainty. The film suggests that true strength is not the absence of hardship, but the willingness to continue despite it. The famous first flight sequence became especially meaningful to audiences because it represented more than Superman learning to fly. Many viewers describe the scene as symbolic of finally overcoming fear, embracing one's identity, or discovering personal confidence after years of self-doubt. One of the greatest strengths of Man of Steel is that its story is driven not simply by spectacular action or visual effects, but by the personal journeys of its characters. Nearly every major figure undergoes some form of emotional development or serves as a reflection of the film's larger themes. Rather than presenting clear heroes and villains defined only by their actions, the film explores how upbringing, belief, sacrifice, and personal responsibility shape the choices people make. Each character represents a different philosophy about identity, purpose, and what it truly means to protect others. Their individual arcs intertwine to create a story that is ultimately about discovering one's place in the world. At the center of everything is Clark Kent, whose transformation into Superman is both physical and emotional. Unlike many superhero origin stories where protagonist quickly embraces their destiny, Clark spends much of the film avoiding it. From childhood, he knows he is different, but he has no understanding of why. His extraordinary abilities isolate him from other children, forcing him to hide his true nature from nearly everyone around him. As a young boy, Clark's greatest struggle is not controlling his strength, but understanding himself. His enhanced hearing, X-ray vision, and superhuman senses overwhelm him, making ordinary situations terrifying. The classroom scene where he becomes unable to process the flood of information entering his mind illustrates this perfectly. Rather than presenting his powers as exciting gifts, the film initially portrays them as a burden. Clark does not dream of becoming a superhero. He simply wants to feel normal. Jonathan and Martha can become the emotional foundation that allows Clark to survive these difficult years. They never encourage him to believe he is superior to others. Instead, they teach humility, patience, compassion, and restraint. These lessons shape Clark far more than his alien biology ever could. Throughout his childhood, he repeatedly chooses kindness over anger despite possessing the ability to dominate anyone who threatens him. As Clark grows older, his internal conflict becomes more complicated. He wants to help people, but fears what humanity's reaction might be if his true identity is revealed. This fear transforms him into a wanderer who moves from job to job, never remaining in one place for very long. Every time he secretly saves someone, he must disappear before anyone discovers who he really is. This lifestyle emphasizes his loneliness. Although surrounded by people, Clark never feels that he truly belongs anywhere. The discovery of the Kryptonian scout ship marks the beginning of his transformation. Meeting Jor-El allows Clark to finally understand where he came from and why he possesses extraordinary abilities. However, this knowledge does not instantly solve his identity crisis. Instead, it presents an even greater challenge. He must now decide whether he belongs to Krypton, Earth, or both. By the end of the film, Clark reaches an important realization. His identity is not determined by biology, but by the choices he makes. He accepts both his Kryptonian heritage and his human upbringing without allowing either to erase the other. Becoming Superman is therefore not simply about wearing a costume or learning to fly. It is about accepting responsibility for using his gifts in service of others. His emotional journey is one of self-acceptance rather than self-discovery alone. General Zod serves as Clark's ideological opposite. While Clark represents freedom and personal growth, Zod represents predetermined purpose. Unlike Clark, Zod was genetically engineered to become a military leader. Every aspect of his personality reflects this design. His loyalty to Krypton is absolute because he literally cannot imagine existing for any other reason. This makes Zod one of the film's most compelling antagonists. He does not seek conquest for personal pleasure or ambition. He genuinely believes his mission is morally correct. Even after Krypton's destruction, rebuilding his civilization remains his only goal. His inability to adapt becomes his greatest weakness. While Clark evolves throughout the story, Zod remains emotionally fixed, incapable of imagining a future different from the one he was created to protect. Ironically, Zod also experiences tragedy. The destruction of Krypton robs him of the society that gave his life meaning. Every soldier under his command shares this loss. Rather than becoming free after Krypton's fall, Zod becomes even more imprisoned by his purpose. when Clark ultimately destroys his plans. Zod loses not only his future, but also the reason for his existence. His final battle is therefore fueled by despair as much as anger. Jonathan Kent experiences one of the most emotionally significant arcs despite relatively limited screen time. Throughout Clark's childhood, Jonathan constantly struggles with balancing two responsibilities. He wants his son to help others, but he also fears humanity's reaction if Clark reveals his extraordinary abilities too early. Jonathan never doubts Clark's goodness. Instead, he doubts whether the world is ready to accept someone so different. His cautious approach often frustrates Clark, who naturally wants to save anyone in danger. Yet Jonathan believes protecting Clark's future is equally important. His willingness to sacrifice his own life during the tornado demonstrates the depth of that conviction. Some viewers interpreted Jonathan's decision as controversial, but emotionally it serves a crucial purpose. His death teaches Clark that being a hero sometimes requires accepting painful consequences. More importantly, Jonathan's sacrifice becomes one of the moral foundations upon which Superman builds his future. Even after Jonathan is gone, Clark continues asking himself what his father would have wanted him to do. Martha Kent provides emotional stability throughout Clark's life. Unlike Jonathan, who often focuses on protecting Clark from the world, Martha consistently reminds him that his character matters more than his origins. One of the most remarkable achievements of Man of Steel is the extraordinary attention given to its costume and production design. Every costume, piece of armor, environment prop, and architectural structure was carefully created to support the film's grounded interpretation of Superman. Rather than simply updating familiar comic book imagery, the filmmakers completely reimagined the visual language of Krypton, Earth, and the characters who inhabit both worlds. Every design choice serves a narrative purpose, helping audiences understand personality, culture, history, and emotion without relying entirely on dialogue. The result is a film whose visual world feels believable despite being filled with advanced alien civilizations and superhuman beings. Perhaps the most recognizable design challenge involves Superman's iconic costume. Few outfits in popular culture are as famous as the classic blue suit with a red cape and red trunks first introduced in comic books decades earlier. Because generations of audiences already associated that design with Superman, the filmmakers understood that even small changes would attract enormous attention. Rather than making superficial adjustments, they decided to rethink the suit from the ground up while preserving its instantly recognizable identity. The most noticeable alteration was the removal of the traditional red trunks worn over the blue suit. For many years, those trunks had reflected the circus strongmen and early comic book heroes who inspired Superman's original creators. By 2013, however, the filmmakers believed modern audiences might view the design as outdated or distracting. Eliminating them created a cleaner silhouette, while giving the costume a more unified appearance. Although this decision initially divided longtime fans, it gradually became one of the defining visual characteristics of Henry Cavill's Superman. Instead of ordinary fabric, Superman's suit was designed to resemble advanced Kryptonian ceremonial armor. The material features thousands of tiny raised textures covering nearly every surface, creating the impression that the costume is woven from an alien material unlike anything found on Earth. Under different lighting conditions, intricate patterns become visible across the chest, arms, legs, and cape, giving the suit remarkable depth and realism. The blue itself is darker than in many previous adaptations. Rather than bright comic book colors, the filmmakers selected deeper shades that complemented the film's overall grounded visual style. The red cape remains vibrant enough to draw attention, but is similarly toned down to appear more natural within real-world environments. The muted color palette allows Superman to feel like a believable individual rather than someone wearing theatrical clothing. The famous House of El symbol also received an extensive redesign. Instead of appearing as a simple shield-shaped emblem attached to the costume, it becomes an integrated part of Kryptonian culture. The symbol is embossed directly into the armor, surrounded by detailed textures that suggest ancient craftsmanship. Within the story, the emblem no longer functions merely as Superman's logo. It represents hope within Kryptonian society and serves as his family's crest, giving it emotional significance far beyond simple visual recognition. Henry Cavill's physical transformation also played an important role in how the costume functioned. Because the filmmakers wanted Superman to appear naturally powerful rather than artificially enhanced, Cavill underwent months of intense physical training before filming. The suit was tailored specifically to emphasize his athletic physique, while avoiding exaggerated muscle padding commonly used in superhero costumes. The result appears strong yet believable, allowing Cavill's own dedication to become part of the character's visual identity. General Zod's armor provides an immediate contrast to Superman's appearance. Although both costumes originate from Kryptonian culture, Zod's armor is significantly darker, heavier, and more militaristic. Sharp lines, angular surfaces, and layered metallic textures communicate authority and discipline before the character even speaks. Every detail reinforces Zod's identity as a career soldier whose entire existence revolves around military purpose. Farrell's costume follows similar principles, while adapting them to her role as an elite warrior. Her armor is sleek, intimidating, and highly functional, emphasizing speed and precision rather than ceremonial grandeur. Unlike many action films where female costumes prioritize style over practicality, Farrell's design appears fully suited for combat. This reinforces her reputation as one of Krypton's deadliest soldiers and contributes significantly to the credibility of her action sequences. Jor-El's clothing differs dramatically from both Superman and Zod. Rather than military armor, his costume combines elegant robes with advanced Kryptonian technology, reflecting his role as a scientist and statesman. Organic patterns, layered materials, and flowing silhouettes distinguish him from the rigid military designs worn by Zod's followers. His appearance communicates wisdom, experience, and intellectual authority rather than physical dominance. Lara Lorvan's wardrobe similarly reflects Kryptonian nobility while maintaining emotional warmth. Soft flowing fabrics combine with subtle technological details, creating a balance between futuristic sophistication and maternal compassion. Her costumes avoid excessive ornamentation, allowing the focus to remain on her emotional connection with Kal-El during Krypton's final moments. Costume design on Earth intentionally shifts toward realism. Jonathan and Martha Kent wear practical Midwestern clothing consisting of denim, work jackets, sweaters, and simple farm attire. Their wardrobe immediately establishes them as hard-working rural Americans. Nothing about their appearance attempts to draw attention, reinforcing the humble values they pass on to Clark throughout his upbringing. Clark's civilian wardrobe also evolves throughout the film. During his years of wandering, he wears practical jackets, boots, jeans, flannel shirts, hooded sweatshirts, and durable work clothing suitable for temporary jobs. One of the most debated yet fascinating aspects of Man of Steel is its screenplay and dialogue. Written by David S. Goyer from a story developed alongside Christopher Nolan, the script intentionally avoids many of the conventions traditionally associated with Superman films. Rather than relying on frequent humor, exaggerated comic book dialogue, or constant exposition, the screenplay embraces a restrained, serious, and emotionally grounded style. Characters rarely deliver lengthy speeches simply to explain the plot. Instead, much of the story unfolds through carefully chosen conversations, visual storytelling, and moments of silence that allow emotions to speak louder than words. This approach gives Man of Steel a tone that feels closer to a science fiction drama than a conventional superhero blockbuster. One of the screenplay's greatest strengths is its willingness to treat every major character as an intelligent individual. The dialogue assumes that audiences can interpret ideas without having every detail explained repeatedly. Conversations often contain philosophical undertones that reflect the film's larger themes of identity, freedom, destiny, sacrifice, and responsibility. Even seemingly simple exchanges frequently carry multiple meanings that become clearer upon repeated viewings. The script also demonstrates remarkable discipline regarding exposition. Superman's origin has been retold countless times across comics, television, and previous films. Instead of repeating familiar information through obvious narration, the screenplay gradually reveals Clark Kent's past through carefully placed flashbacks. Every memory appears because something in the present triggers it emotionally. This structure allows audiences to learn about Clark's childhood while simultaneously following his adult journey toward becoming Superman. Dialogue between Clark and Jonathan Kent forms the emotional foundation of the screenplay. Their conversations rarely focus on Clark's incredible powers themselves. Instead, they explore how those powers should be used. Jonathan consistently encourages Clark to think beyond immediate emotional reactions and consider the long-term consequences of revealing his abilities. These discussions are never presented as simple right or wrong moral lessons. Instead, they illustrate the impossible responsibility faced by parents raising a child unlike anyone else in the world. One of Jonathan's most memorable conversations occurs after Clark saves a school bus full of children. Rather than immediately praising him, Jonathan asks whether the world is ready to accept someone with extraordinary abilities. Clark struggles with this idea because his instinct is always to help others. The exchange perfectly captures the film's central conflict between compassion and caution. Neither character completely convinces the other, making the dialogue feel authentic rather than artificially designed to provide clear answers. Martha Kent's dialogue serves a different purpose. While Jonathan often represents caution and preparation, Martha consistently reminds Clark to trust his heart. Her conversations are shorter, warmer, and emotionally reassuring. Rather than discussing abstract philosophical ideas, she focuses on Clark as her son. Her words reinforce the idea that identity is shaped not by biological origin, but by love, family, and personal character. These quieter moments provide emotional balance within a story filled with enormous stakes. Jor-El delivers some of the screenplay's most inspirational dialogue. Because he appears primarily through advanced Kryptonian artificial intelligence, his conversations naturally contain greater exposition than other characters. However, the screenplay avoids making these scenes feel like simple information dumps. Instead, Jor-El speaks as both a scientist and a father, combining historical explanation with emotional encouragement. His speeches emphasize hope, possibility, and freedom of choice. Unlike Kryptonian society, where every citizen follows a predetermined purpose, Jor-El believes Clark's future should be defined by his own decisions. This philosophy becomes one of the screenplay's most important ideas. Jor-El does not tell Clark exactly who he must become. Instead, he explains that humanity will ultimately decide whether to follow Clark's example once he chooses to reveal himself. General Zod's dialogue presents an equally compelling but opposing philosophy. Nearly everything Zod says reflects absolute certainty. He never questions his mission because he believes he was literally created to fulfill it. Michael Shannon's commanding delivery enhances the screenplay's carefully constructed language, transforming relatively straightforward sentences into declarations of unwavering conviction. One of the reasons Zod became such a memorable antagonist is that the script avoids portraying him as irrationally evil. His dialogue consistently explains his actions through loyalty to Krypton rather than personal ambition. Even when threatening humanity, Zod speaks as someone carrying out what he sincerely believes to be a sacred responsibility. This gives the conflict greater emotional complexity because audiences understand why Zod acts as he does, even while recognizing the horrifying consequences of his plan. The screenplay also handles Lois Lane differently than many previous Superman adaptations. Her dialogue immediately establishes her intelligence, curiosity, and determination. Lois asks difficult questions, challenges authority, and pieces together evidence through investigative journalism rather than relying on coincidence. Conversations involving Lois often move the plot forward while simultaneously revealing her character. She earns Clark's trust through her actions rather than simply because the story requires it. The relationship between Clark and Lois develops gradually through understated dialogue rather than dramatic romantic declarations. Their conversations focus primarily on trust, curiosity, and shared understanding. This restrained approach allows their connection to feel believable despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding them. Romance exists beneath the surface without overwhelming the larger narrative. Another notable characteristic of the screenplay is its limited use of humor. The marketing campaign for Man of Steel was one of the most ambitious and carefully planned promotional efforts ever created for a Superman film. Warner Brothers understood that this was not simply another superhero movie. The studio was attempting to reintroduce one of the most iconic fictional characters in history to a modern audience, while simultaneously distancing the new film from previous adaptations. Every trailer, poster, interview, promotional event, and advertising partnership was designed around one central message. Superman was returning, but audiences had never seen him quite like this before. One of the biggest challenges facing the marketing team was overcoming comparisons to earlier Superman films. Christopher Reeve portrayal remained deeply beloved, and Superman Returns had been released only a few years earlier. Rather than presenting Man of Steel as a continuation of existing stories, Warner Brothers emphasized that this was a complete reinvention. Promotional material consistently highlighted the words from producers of the Dark Knight trilogy, immediately connecting the project to Christopher Nolan's enormously successful Batman films. Christopher Nolan's name became one of the campaign's strongest selling points. Although Zack Snyder directed the film, advertisements repeatedly reminded audiences that Nolan served as producer and helped develop the story. This association gave potential viewers confidence that Superman would receive the same thoughtful, grounded treatment that had transformed Batman into one of cinema's most respected superheroes. For many moviegoers, Nolan's involvement suggested that Man of Steel will be more than a traditional comic book adventure. The first teaser trailer immediately established the film's unique identity. Instead of opening with explosions or large-scale action, it focused almost entirely on Clark Kent's childhood and his quiet search for purpose. Peaceful images of rural Kansas, fishing boats, wheat fields, mountain landscapes, and family life dominated the early footage. Slow editing, emotional narration, and Hans Zimmer's gradually building music created an atmosphere that felt reflective rather than spectacular. Interestingly, two slightly different versions of this first teaser were released. One featured narration by Jonathan Kent, while the other used dialogue from Jor-El. Although the visuals remained nearly identical, the change in narration subtly shifted the emotional focus. Jonathan's version emphasized Clark's humanity and upbringing, while Jor-El's version highlighted destiny and hope. Fans immediately began comparing both trailers online, analyzing every line of dialogue and every brief glimpse of footage for hidden meaning. These early teasers generated enormous curiosity because they revealed remarkably little about the actual story. Superman barely appeared in costume. General Zod remained absent, and major action scenes were almost completely hidden. Instead of revealing the entire plot, Warner Brothers chose to create intrigue by emphasizing atmosphere and emotion. This restraint proved highly effective, generating millions of online views and widespread discussion across social media platforms. As the release date approached, later trailers gradually introduced more of the film's spectacular visual effects. Audiences received their first detailed looks at Krypton, Superman's flight, General Zod, Lois Lane, and enormous battles that would dominate the film's second half. However, even these trailers avoided revealing the complete narrative. Major plot twists, emotional moments, and the controversial ending remained carefully protected, allowing viewers to experience them for the first time in theaters. Hans Zimmer's music became one of the campaign's most recognizable elements. Rather than using generic trailer music, promotional videos prominently featured themes from the film's actual score. The emotional crescendo accompanying Superman's first flight quickly became associated with the movie itself. Long before audiences saw the completed film, Zimmer's music had already established its emotional identity, creating excitement whenever new promotional material appeared. The official posters also reflected the film's grounded approach. Earlier Superman marketing often featured bright colors, smiling heroes, and triumphant poses. Man of Steel adopted a dramatically different style. Many posters used muted blue and gray color palettes, with Superman standing alone against vast skies or city skylines. Henry Cavill rarely smiled in promotional photographs. Instead, he appeared thoughtful, determined, and quietly confident, reinforcing the more serious tone of the story. One of the most memorable posters featured Superman floating high above Earth, while sunlight illuminated the cloud below him. The image communicated scale, isolation, and hope simultaneously. Rather than emphasizing combat or destruction, the composition suggested that Superman existed somewhere between humanity and the heavens, visually reinforcing the film's central themes of identity and responsibility. Character posters were also released featuring Superman, General Zod, Lois Lane, Jor-El, Fariel, and other important figures. These images allowed audiences to examine the redesigned Kryptonian costumes in remarkable detail. Fans immediately began discussing the intricate textures, armor designs, and updated House of El symbol. The costume redesign itself became one of the campaign's most talked about topics months before the film reached theaters. General Zod's promotional campaign deserves particular attention. Warner Brothers released an in-universe message from Zod addressed directly to the people of Earth. Styled as an emergency broadcast, the video warned humanity that Kal-El must surrender himself or face devastating consequences. This creative marketing strategy blurred the line between fiction and reality, making audiences feel as though Zod were communicating directly with them. The campaign generated enormous online discussion because it expanded the film's world beyond traditional advertising. The viral marketing extended to official websites featuring Kryptonian language, symbols, and hidden interactive elements. Fans could explore aspects of Kryptonian culture, decode alien writing, and examine fictional technology from the movie. Man of Steel occupies a unique place in Superman cinematic history because it is both a faithful adaptation of many core elements from the comics and a bold reinterpretation that deliberately departs from earlier films. Rather than attempting to recreate what audiences had already experienced, director Zack Snyder, producer Christopher Nolan, and screenwriter David S. Goyer approached Superman from an entirely new perspective. To fully appreciate what makes Man of Steel distinctive, it is helpful to compare it not only with previous Superman adaptations, but also with other modern superhero films and Zack Snyder's own body of work. These comparisons reveal why the film remains one of the most discussed and influential comic book movies ever made. The most obvious comparison is with Superman, the movie released in 1978. Directed by Richard Donner and starring Christopher Reeve, that film established the cinematic image of Superman for an entire generation. Donner's version embraced optimism, bright colors, classical heroism, and the belief that Superman represented the very best qualities humanity could aspire to achieve. Reeve portrayed Clark Kent with warmth, charm, and confidence, creating a hero who inspired audiences through kindness as much as through incredible power. Man of Steel takes a dramatically different approach. Henry Cavill's Superman begins his journey uncertain of his place in the world. Instead of immediately embracing his destiny, he spends years searching for purpose while hiding from society. The film focuses heavily on identity, isolation, and emotional conflict before allowing Clark to become humanity's symbol of hope. While Christopher Reeve's Superman often inspired people through unwavering certainty, Cavill's version inspires through perseverance despite uncertainty. Visually, the differences between the two films are equally striking. Superman. The movie features bright primary colors, elegant flying sequences, and a sense of wonder that reflects the comic book storytelling traditions of its era. Man of Steel adopts muted color grading, natural lighting, handheld camera work, and realistic visual effects designed to make extraordinary events feel believable. Both films celebrate Superman, but they speak the cinematic language of very different generations. The two versions also differ significantly in their approach to action. Richard Donner's Superman often solves problems through intelligence, compassion, and relatively restrained demonstrations of power. In contrast, Man of Steel depicts Kryptonian combat on an unprecedented scale. Advances in visual effects allowed Zack Snyder to portray Superman's speed and strength with astonishing realism. Buildings collapse, sonic booms echo across cities, and battles resemble natural disasters. This reflects changing audience expectations regarding blockbuster action between the late 20th century and the modern era. Another important comparison involves Superman Returns from 2006. Directed by Bryan Singer and starring Brandon Routh, that film intentionally served as a spiritual continuation of Christopher Reeve's Superman rather than a complete reboot. Singer carefully recreated the visual style, musical themes, and emotional tone of the earlier films. Brandon Routh delivered a respectful performance that closely honored Reeves' interpretation. Although many viewers appreciated Superman Returns, others felt it relied too heavily on nostalgia. The film emphasized Superman's absence and emotional longing rather than introducing substantial new ideas. Man of Steel intentionally moved in the opposite direction. Instead of preserving continuity with previous films, it reinvented Superman's mythology from the beginning. Krypton received far greater attention. Clark's childhood became more psychologically detailed, and General Zod replaced Lex Luthor as the central antagonist. The relationship between Clark and Lois Lane also differs considerably between these films. Superman Returns focuses heavily on romance and emotional regret, with Clark returning to discover that Lois has built a new life during his absence. Man of Steel delays romantic development, choosing instead to establish mutual respect and trust before emphasizing love. Amy Adams portrays Lois as an accomplished investigative journalist whose intelligence drives the story forward rather than simply reacting to Superman's actions. Comparisons with Batman Begins and The Dark Knight are equally revealing. Christopher Nolan's influence on Man of Steel is immediately apparent. Both films explore how extraordinary individuals might realistically exist within recognizable modern societies. They prioritize psychological depth, moral ambiguity, and emotional realism over colorful comic book spectacle. Like Bruce Wayne in Batman Begins, Clark Kent spends years searching for purpose before embracing his role as a protector. However, important differences remain. Batman operates within the limitations of ordinary human abilities, relying on training, technology, and fear to fight crime. Superman possesses almost unlimited physical power, making his greatest challenges internal rather than external. Batman struggles with whether his mission will consume his humanity. Superman struggles with whether humanity will ever accept him at all. These contrasting conflicts reflect the unique philosophies underlying each character despite sharing similar grounded storytelling approaches. Man of Steel also invites comparison with the rapidly expanding Marvel Cinematic Universe. By 2013, films such as Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, The First Avenger, and The Avengers had established Marvel's signature style. Those movies frequently balanced dramatic moments with humor, fast-paced dialogue, colorful visuals, and interconnected storytelling.